Welcome to this FTNCI episode. I'm Cody Leibelt talking with Pastor Jeff Kahl today, and we are going to look at Calvin Coolidge's 150th anniversary of the United States speech. He is celebrating the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we're doing this because it just so happens this year is the 250th anniversary. So we're looking back at the history of the United States and we're looking at this important speech. Calvin Coolidge was one of the best American presidents, one that we celebrate, one that we want to say this is what a good president looks like. He was correcting the work of recent presidents, especially Woodrow Wilson, who had been abandoning the principles on which our country was founded, who had openly stated such things as that we ought to revisit and reconsider and perhaps rewrite our Declaration of Independence. Coolidge says no. And Coolidge was a man who was like-minded with much of what we stand for at FTNCI. So Pastor Jeff, thank you for being here to discuss this and to share what you love about this speech.
Well, thank you very much, Cody, and I'm very grateful that you were willing to go ahead with this. I really think Coolidge's speech embodies the heart of what For the New Intellectual is all about. So I think looking at Coolidge's speech can not only illuminate things that we care about, but hopefully give us a model for how we can look at our role in American politics and culture going forward. So I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of background on Coolidge and maybe some unconventional facts about Coolidge that I just think are really cool to know. No pun intended there. But Calvin Coolidge was born in the 1870s in Vermont, and he was the son of staunch Calvinist Christians. It's not a secret that his real name was John Calvin Coolidge, and he was raised specifically by his father with very stern Puritan virtues: thrift, independence, hard work, faithfulness to religious piety, all of those things that are the backbone of traditional American culture. Coolidge was fed those on a regular basis by his dad. He apprenticed as a lawyer after college. He was a very quiet, introverted guy. His nickname later in his life was Silent Cal. He married a very vivacious and extroverted lady named Grace Goodhue, who was a teacher of the deaf. And she went on to being, for her time, a very popular first lady. He opened up a law practice in Northampton, Massachusetts. He ended up being the mayor of Northampton, used that as a springboard to become the governor of Massachusetts. All of these on the Republican ticket, by the way. And he really singled himself out for his political leadership in 1919 when the Boston police went on strike as a way of intimidating the formation of a policeman's union. They felt that they deserved to have union protections, and so they went on strike. Calvin called in the National Guard. He quelled the strike. He eventually fired all the strikers who refused to submit. And he basically said, look, public servants don't have the right to strike against the public good. There is no such right that exists. And even the Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, commended him on that courageous leadership. And just a footnote, in the 1980s, when the air traffic controllers went on strike during the Reagan administration, Reagan also fired all the air traffic controllers, and he pointed to Calvin Coolidge as his model for the way to handle essentially bureaucrats, government employees who were trying to get the better and to take power that the Constitution doesn't give them and does not permit them to have. He eventually, because of that, he was regularly perceived as an honest man of integrity. And so in 1920, when the Democrats were running Warren Harding on a pledge to kind of reverse the progressive policies of the previous decades, they put Calvin Coolidge on as his vice presidential candidate. And in office, Coolidge was the first vice president to regularly attend cabinet meetings. In 1923, I believe it was in June, Warren Harding died of a heart attack. And many people speculate that that was because there were some scandals brewing within his administration. A few cabinet members that were doing some unsavory deals, the most famous being the Teapot Dome scandal. So Coolidge assumed the office of the president. He was in his father's farmhouse in Vermont when word got out that Harding had died. And his father, who was a notary, was the one who swore him into office in their old farmhouse. And I like that image of a common man, kind of having a very common touch. When he got to office, he very much governed with an America First anti-progressive foreign policy. One of his first acts was to sign the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. And it wasn't necessarily out of racist motives as much as it was there were great fears that socialists and anarchists were infiltrating the country. And there was some evidence of this in the Wilson administration. There were bombings and there were all kinds of violent acts that were happening. And so Coolidge signed into law in 1924 an act that greatly restricted immigration. So immigration restriction is not a new trend among Republican politicians. Some people make it seem like that, but it really wasn't. He was also very much a non-interventionist in foreign affairs. He was anti-intervention, but he was pro-self-defense. He believed that America had the right to defend itself. He just didn't think we should be intervening in other countries willy-nilly. He lowered the income tax. When he was vice president, the highest rate was 58%, and he lowered it to 24%. He cut a lot of business regulations, and with the help of his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who was an amazing financier, by the way, he lowered the federal budget and cut government spending rather than raising taxes. He ran for re-election in 1924 in his own right. And he was so popular, the slogan of his campaign was "Keep Cool with Coolidge." And even the Democrats realized in that election that they had to run a conservative. They ran a man from West Virginia by the name of John W. Davis. And the progressives broke off and they ran a third party candidate, Robert La Follette, who was a hardcore progressive. But John W. Davis was the last genuine conservative Democrat to run for office, for the presidency, anyways. And there's a book that I read by Garland Tucker called The High Tide of American Conservatism. And Tucker argues in that book that this was the last election when the Americans did not have to choose the lesser of two evils. They had to choose the greater of two goods, because he evaluated that both John W. Davis and Calvin Coolidge were great guys and they had the right policies on most issues. And either one of them would have been a good choice for America. And I think that that's just a forgotten piece of history that we had an election like that. Coolidge won the election, but during the campaign, his son, Calvin, died of sepsis. And even though it really struck Calvin and Grace with an incredible amount of grief, they pushed onward and they credited their Christian faith with giving them the strength to continue the campaign and to ultimately serve a second term, even under those emotional conditions. He refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate government. And he did so because he felt that it did not have the consent of the Soviet people. And that's something that, we sometimes wish that future American presidents would have acknowledged, like Franklin Roosevelt, who really gave Stalin trust that he didn't deserve, in my opinion. He also had strong views on race, Coolidge did. Woodrow Wilson, the progressive, was a horrid racist who resegregated much of the federal government. And when Coolidge came in, he undid that act and he allowed African Americans to serve at various positions within the government bureaucracy. And he refused to hire any known member of the Ku Klux Klan for any government position. And there had been kind of a resurgence of Klan activity in the 1920s. So it's to his credit that Calvin refused to acknowledge that. He also advocated for strong lynching laws. And he was the president who gave full citizenship to the American Indians, and he allowed them to retain their tribal lands. So while there is in certain quarters of academia today this image that it's the Republicans who historically have been the racists, Calvin Coolidge's presidency very much undoes that image. He very much had strong views on civil rights. I do want to, before I get done, because Coolidge is one of my favorite presidents, but I do want to burst everybody's bubble with one negative on Coolidge. One of the worst federal agencies that strict constitutionalists regularly rail on is the Federal Reserve. And we often blame the progressives, and particularly Woodrow Wilson, for signing the original Federal Reserve Act into law in 1913. And that's true. It was a progressive move. But even then, like every other national bank in American history, the Federal Reserve Act only gave the Fed a 20-year charter. And so, in theory, after 20 years, there would have been a rigorous debate in Congress, and the Fed would have had to justify its continued existence. But in 1927, a bill came up on the floor of Congress called the McFadden Act. And this act had many different financial provisions, and none of them were particularly good. All of them were government intruding into the banking industry. But among the provisions was a provision to extend the Fed's charter into perpetuity. In other words, basically making the Federal Reserve a permanent feature in the national government. And that was the first time that a proposal like that had come for a federal bank, a national bank, to be a permanent feature in Washington. The McFadden Act passed with 80% Republican support because many Republicans in that day were more progressive, and almost half of the Democrats' support. And unfortunately, Calvin Coolidge was the one who signed the McFadden Act into law. So while I still unreservedly admire Calvin, he was the one, you could say, who gave us the permanence of the Federal Reserve and all of the nasty policies that have come out of that institution ever since. The Fed has failed fundamentally at its mandate of maintaining a stable economy and a stable currency. And I give that example mainly because in today's climate, a lot of people think that if we just get the right guy in politics, everything will be fine. But what I think this shows is that even the best of American presidents, the ones that we admire, the ones who literally had a temptation, or not a temptation, but a tendency towards small, limited, restrained federal government, even those presidents are going to do things that sometimes we don't like because politics, by its very nature, has multiple influences that come into the decision-making process. And even a president as good as Coolidge is going to do some things that he probably, if he were here today, would say, yeah, I regret doing that. And so as we look at some of the policies that come out of Washington today, even from administrations and from politicians that we like, we have to understand that politics is a dirty business and it is not the vehicle by which the salvation of this country is going to come. So even the best presidents, and I rate Calvin in the top 5, even they're going to disappoint us and do some things that have bad consequences long term. And that's already long enough, so I'll leave it there.
What you're describing about Coolidge's actions with the Federal Reserve reminds me that knowledge is gained from observation and induction and trial and error in many cases. We cannot deductively approach the theory of government and say, okay, well, since we believe in some of the propositions in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life and the liberty and pursuit of happiness, and presumably property, therefore, such and such laws all must deductively follow.
Mhm.
Rather, it's through studying history with the lens of principles that we can learn things like this. So, Jeff, you have some notes here about this speech. Now, was there anything that you wanted to share just about the occasion of the speech to set us up for why this was given and where it was given?
Not really. I mean, it was given in 1926 in Philadelphia, or near Philadelphia, I should say. And it was very much done with the idea that he wanted to celebrate the founding of our country, and he wanted to root, I think, the speech in something more than merely a folksy patriotism rooted in nothing but the fact that, hey, we're Americans and we're great, or America is my country and therefore I'm patriotic. The overwhelming sense that the speech communicates is that America is fundamentally great because it is a nation based on propositions. It is a nation rooted in fundamental ideas. And as the Federalist Papers would say, it is a nation that was founded on deliberation and choice, which means it is a nation that didn't just come into being through the forces of history, through power and through domination, and then it just happened to be, like many of the nations throughout history came into being. This is a nation that came together because the men of the time got together, debated great ideas, and formulated a nation based on some fundamental principles that would be the touchstone of why we exist as a nation. Not just that we exist, but why we exist.
That was the most impressive thing to me when I listened to the speech the other day. I found someone on YouTube reading through the speech, and Coolidge goes out of his way to say, we could celebrate the fact that this good nation formed, but I want you to know that this is a different kind of nation than had been formed in the past. This is a nation that is formed on these principles, not just on the will of the people to get rid of some other tyrant, but we wanted to replace it with principles. And it was because of that that the United States became a beacon to the world, that people would want to move to the United States, that other countries would want to become more like the United States, and that this idea of a rights-based government, an individual rights-based government, could be spreading throughout the entire world because people saw how effective it was and they saw how it was different from what had come before.
Mm.
Well, let's jump into the speech. If you would like, I can bring up my favorite quote from it, or if you can share with me where you'd like to go as far as the order.
Well, why don't we start with your favorite quote? Because if it's the one I'm thinking of, Cody, it's the one that most people acknowledge as the touchstone of the speech.
Yeah, we'll start there. I shared this on social media the other day, and it was, for me, for my size of audience, one of my more viral posts. A lot of people, especially at this specific time in American politics, are looking at this and saying, oh, okay, so we don't have to be the progressive left. We also don't have to be the woke right, so to speak.
Yes.
We
Mhm.
can have pride in our country's principles. And this is a clear statement about the principles. Coolidge says this: if all men are created equal, that is final.
Mm.
If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. And so I would analyze today's political discussions, and I would say the woke right wants to move backward to
Yeah.
primordial history, and the progressive left wants to work backward to tyranny and to slave states. There is no adapting the principles of Americanism in a better direction than they already have been established. They are as
Mm.
good as they are going to get. Now, the question of how we implement them, what's the right order of new laws and policies that come out in our actual legislative body, That's a different question. But the principles, the goal of our legislative body ought not to change.
Yes, and just to piggyback on that, one of the liberal progressives publications that has been around forever is the New Republic, they call it. And they use that word new in there because they want to emphasize that in their minds, they're moving forward. They're progressing beyond the republic that our founding fathers bequeathed to us. But if you actually understand what they're proposing, the progressives have always been wanting to go back to a Platonic view of a republic where you have at the top a philosopher king or a small group of educated elites who kind of discern the general will of the people and then, or claim to discern it. But what they end up doing is forcing it on everybody else. That is essentially Plato's understanding of what a republic is. So it's not a more progressive version of a republic. It's actually going back to ancient Greece, and not just to ancient Greece, but to the worst of ancient Greece.
And this is not only the vision that we see in Plato's Republic or in Plato's concept, Plato invented the idea of communism, just
Yeah.
so that's clear historically. It's also represented in, say, the idea of ancient Egypt's pharaoh building the pyramids, where he embodies the will of the people and he embodies the nation. It's also something that you could find in various other tyrannies, where you would treat the leader of the country as the embodiment of the will of the people. And
Yep.
therefore, the leader of the country, his job is to come up with the vision and to express the vision to the people and to say, this is what kind of nation we're going to be. This is what we will spend our money on. And this is tyranny. This is what tyranny means. And the opposite of that is what we are trying to create in the United States and have been from the beginning. You can think about the history of the United States as a group of settlers and a group of pioneers coming to a new land and bringing with them basically their families and their axes, and then creating a civilization and then asking themselves, what do we need in order to be at peace with our neighbors? And so they were inductively asking themselves the question, what do we have to agree with our neighbors in order that there will be just laws? And those just laws, they ended up being the things that preserve their right to their life, liberty, pursuit of property. That's what the laws are about. And so, of course, they were aware of the old world, but these frontiersmen they brought with them some of the ideas from the old world, but they were willing to rethink them and to say, this is what we need here for our lives. And because of that contact that they had with reality, with the needs of reality, they were able to set up for themselves constitutions before the American Revolution. They were able to set up for themselves city halls and places for the resolution of conflicts. And so Calvin, in his speech, argues that when the American Revolution happened, this was actually an act of conserving the order that was already established against the encroachment of someone who wanted to fundamentally change the order. So we could think about it from one point of view or another. The American Revolution is indeed a revolution, but the revolution took place in the minds of the people before the war took place. And
Mhm.
the reason why the war took place is because the people had already settled on a certain way of life and they realized it was good and it worked. And they decided they wanted to defend it against an encroachment by a foreign power at that point.
Mhm.
So these are some ideas to think about as we look into the speech. And also just keep in mind that Coolidge comes after Woodrow Wilson, who had tried to reframe the Declaration of Independence basically as a rhetorical introduction, a device to get people on Jefferson's side. Wilson had downplayed the actual content of the Declaration. And here is Coolidge correcting Wilson.
Yes. And I would just, as addition to what you just said, I personally know many conservatives who would argue exactly the same thing, that the Declaration of Independence should not be seen as in any way a statement of American principles. It is a rhetorical device. It is a document of foreign policy to make arguments to other countries, but not necessarily stating the fundamental values by which our country will remain enmeshed. And so there is a sense in which you can see equally from certain conservative intellectuals the same kind of disdain for the Declaration of Independence as anything more than a historical document, but not necessarily proclaiming any principles that have ongoing significance for the American experiment.
Well, let's dig into the notes that you have here. You point out in the first paragraph, he brings up images of new birth, new life, and you say this harkens back to Lincoln merging the political with the spiritual. Talk to me about this. What is the idea here?
Well, when you look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which is the touchstone of his political thinking and rhetoric, and I use rhetoric in the best sense of the word here, what you see is a deliberate attempt to merge the fundamental Christian undertones that shaped the country with a direct appeal to the founding vision of the American experiment. And what I see in Coolidge's speech is a similar concern to see first of all, just the idea that the birth of America was a new birth. In Lincoln's phrase, a new birth of freedom. Although Lincoln would say that in 1776, the nation was conceived, but not necessarily yet fully born. And that's a piece where we have to at least question Lincoln's verbiage there. But clearly, in Coolidge's speech, America was born in 1776. This was the complete coming into being of a new life, of a new nation. And he uses that phrase, new life and new birth, not just to signal, yes, this is the physical birth of a new nation, but it really is a spiritual new birth. It is the coming into being of new ideas, new principles, divine principles, I think he would even say, that are going to guide this nation that has just been born. And if you look at the second and third paragraphs, in the second paragraph, he uses a lot of religious language, reverence and respect, coming to Philadelphia as to a holy shrine and referring to the founding fathers as inspired men, almost the way we would talk about, the gospel writers or something. So you have this sense that in some ways, the founding of America was rooted in great spiritual and religious truth. But then if you go to the next paragraph, Coolidge uses words that are more practical and experiential language. He talks about human experience, the value of our institutions, dependability, the test of experience. So, what we have here is we have these ideas and these principles that were given birth to, but they're not just floating abstractions. They're not just grand ideals that live in the mind of enlightened statesmen. They have borne the test of experience. As you said, Cody, they have been forged in the American frontier where there was no existing civilization, but it had to be built from the ground up. And so Coolidge is saying this to me is like an Aristotelian joining of spirit and matter. It's not you have to pick one or the other. It is the American spirit and the American matter are both equally essential for understanding what America is. And so today you have some conservatives who focus only on the American matter, that we were a European nation founded by Europeans. And it's a very race conscious and culture conscious thing. And then you have other people that talk exclusively about America as just this abstract idea that hasn't fully been realized yet. We still have to implement all these new policies to make America more just, more equal, and all these other things. And Coolidge is saying, no, what happened in 1776 was a full fusion of the American spirit and the American experience. And so you don't have to choose ideas or experience. Both are equally a part of what made America America. And if you lose either one of those, you risk losing the country. But I think in Coolidge's speech, he would say specifically, if you lose the ideas, if you lose the principles that made America what it was and is, you're going to lose it. It's not going to exist.
So I did a word search on his speech, and the term spirit or spiritual
Mhm.
comes up 11 different times. And I think
Yeah.
it's helpful to realize from his point of view, the spiritual or the word spirit, it's referring to what are the values, the moral values of this people. He is positioning the American founding fathers as the people that opened up a door to a better way of looking at how people should treat each other, what's right and wrong morally. And you can compare that also to the understanding that Ayn Rand and that we would have at FTNCI, the idea of the spiritual versus the material. These are two important categories, but we don't divorce them from each other. For example, if you imagine Adam and Eve in the garden, if they had not sinned, if they had continued doing exactly what God designed them to do, they lived in a material world
Mhm.
and they were accomplishing spiritual good by tending the garden. That was their work. Their work was spiritual, even though it was material. We don't divide those two concepts. So whenever we're talking about spiritual in this speech, he's talking about the vision for how you can live in a way that is good. So let me just read through a couple points where he uses the term spirit or spiritual. He says that this is a framework of a spiritual event, this new forming country. A new spirit had arisen on this side of the Atlantic. He says there's a spirit of the pioneer, he refers to. And as the speech goes on, the instances of this term come up more and more. So he points out, I'll skip one or two of them, but he points out that the Declaration is a great spiritual document. It is
Mhm.
a declaration not of material, but of spiritual conceptions. And then toward the end, he explains that the forming of the country was a great spiritual development, and it acquired a great moral power. It's the product of a spiritual insight of the people. He says, the things of the Spirit come first. It almost sounds like he wishes that he were a pastor, or that he wishes that the Americans would make a connection between the fact that they are, many of them, Christians, and
Mhm.
also that they are Americans, and that these things are compatible with each other, and in fact, well suited to each other.
Yeah.
And then
If I can interject, I think part of his concern genuinely was the fact that Coolidge saw, I mean, he oversaw the Roaring Twenties, which was one of the greatest decades of prosperity in our nation's history. And this was the decade when so many things that we take for granted in America today actually started coming into existence and shaping the culture, the presence of so many things in big cities and even small towns now that the founders would never have foreseen the
right, like
technological.
going to a grocery store and finding orange juice.
Right.
This was an
And
innovation at that time.
absolutely, absolutely. You would be sitting around all day preparing your food for dinner. And in the 1920s, you could get canned food that you could easily heat up and all that stuff. But I think what Coolidge is genuinely worried about is, on the one hand, he doesn't want Americans to get so overwhelmed with the materialism that has been developing in America under his watch and to a certain extent prior to that, but to also recognize the spiritual truths, the moral truths, as you phrased it, that produced that material abundance. And what he sees in the country is a new spirit that had been taking hold for decades and was institutionalized under, you could argue, Teddy Roosevelt to a certain extent, and certainly under Woodrow Wilson, the professor, the academic president that we had. And I think he is legitimately trying to push back on that. And he's trying to get Americans to think, what are the ideas that really shaped and are unique to America, that made America unique? And what are the ideas that are coming in now that are actually going to undermine that? And of course, he's pointing to German progressivism indirectly in the speech, but certainly that's what he's thinking of as he's writing this speech.
Your notes here talk about the 8th through 10th paragraphs. The revolutionary leaders were representing the broad spirit of their constituencies. They were not merely acting as insurgents, they acted through a reasonable, popularly delegated process.
Hmm.
This is a clear rebuke of the progressive mindset, Wilson and others, as well as the socialists and the anarchists. So, yeah, and as I was listening to this speech this week, that is something that also stood out to me is that it's interesting. Coolidge was not shy, even though he was a quiet Cal. He was not shy to say, this is
No.
what my opponents are saying, and this is why they're mistaken. And so his section in the speech here does cover this question of was the American Revolution a movement of the intelligentsia in America in the 1770s? Was it a movement only of several men that were highly wealthy? And that's a claim that you'll hear if you read the revisionist history. Or was America the revolution of the poor people, say like the lower class? And he talks about it in a joking way. And he says, in one sense, we didn't have lower class in the United
Right.
States or in the Americas at that time, because he says that there were not people that were morally debased, that were just living on the edge of poverty and that were dealing with each other by thievery and things like that. He says we had a moral people. The poverty that we saw in the Americas at that time would have been the poverty of somebody who had built a farm on the frontier and was
Hmm.
working to create wealth. That's a different kind of poverty than the poverty of the thief or the pickpocket. So he points
Or
out,
the moocher.
yeah, and he points out that the Americans at that time, they generally had this understanding of what was morally necessary for them to, like, what individual rights are, what a government ought to be. This is something that came from the poorest of the poor, from the middle wealth, from the rich. And so he points out that, like in your notes here, the revolutionary leaders were representing the broad spirit of their
Yes.
constituencies. And he
Mhm.
even goes to the length of saying there were some people that were at the convention meetings that would come with one concept, but they would say, I'm listening to the letters that my constituents are sending me, and they are
Mhm.
saying this is what they think.
Yes.
So I'm going to represent them. This was built into the process. And you can look at the formation of a government and ask yourself, what is the definition of justice? What should be outlined in the laws? But you can also ask, is there a just process by which those laws should come into being? Because
Mm.
theoretically, a monarch could come in or a tyrant could come in and say, I'm writing a constitution and everything's going to now be this way. And that has no connection to the understanding of the population. We see
Mm.
that in the nation building experiments, say in Iraq 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's not what happened in the United States. It was a movement of the entire populace.
Yes. In fact, I would even go on to say that to simply say that 1776 was the founding of America is somewhat deceptive. I would say that 1776 was the articulation of the founding. It was, in a sense, the beginning of the institutionalizing of the founding. But the full American founding was a 150-year process from the first settlers in the 1620s and even earlier than that, up to the imperial crisis beginning in the 1760s, where these colonists came to a new nation and their thinking, while they definitely had certain ideas and certain intuitions that they brought with them from Europe, those things were radically reforged by their experience of building new communities, of finding new ways to relate to one another, experimenting. A lot of people talk about, the various constitutions that were made in the colonies throughout the colonial period. Those were experiments. They were ways to try to draft a just government, and some of them worked and some of them didn't work, and they needed to be radically rethought. So that by the time you get to 1776 and after that, the American Constitution actually, in many ways, was adopted from many state constitutions that had been in effect for years, decades already, because they had this wealth of knowledge and experience, actual empirical experience that they then shaped in their minds and drew conclusions from. So Madison isn't starting de novo in 1787 with nothing. He is starting with a wealth of experience from the constituents of the various colonies for decades prior. And so the Constitution that was developed it wasn't just the craft of a few intellectuals in Philadelphia. It was the collective of experience of an entire nation. And that's why when Jefferson said that the Declaration was an expression of the American mind, he wasn't wrong. I mean, it really did express the overall sentiments of the American people at that time.
You have a comment in your notes that there was this idea Coolidge brings up of political speculation. And he uses the idea of political speculation not as a negative, but as a positive. But he says that it should be followed by political action by the
Yes.
people as well as by the government. And this is a unity of thought and action. And you pointed out this is Aristotelian in its philosophy, that there
Mhm.
ought to be these two things married together. I like that there was this long history of political speculation. And Coolidge points this out in the speech that it wasn't like Jefferson sat down and originated the ideas that he put into the Declaration.
Yeah.
Not at all. He was familiar with much speculative work that had gone on before that. And in the speech here, Coolidge brings up several historical thinkers that go back 100 years or nearly 100 years. So share with me about that. You talk about the 16th to 19th paragraphs.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say, in relation to political speculation and political action, one insight that Bradley Thompson really helped me understand is when you read the Declaration, the words say that it is necessary for the people to engage and declare their separation from their mother country. And that word necessary was intentionally chosen by Jefferson and the other original transcribers of the Declaration, because the idea is we've speculated on this. We see the implications of what is happening with our mother country, the unjust taxes, the Parliament and King George exceeding their authority in the colonies. And now that we see this truth, it is necessary for us to do something about it. Truth should lead to action. And one of the things that's frustrating with much of what we see in politics today is that I think people are afraid to act when they know that there's corruption in government, when they know that government has overstepped its bounds. But the founding fathers, and I think Coolidge understood that if you've speculated on politics and you understand what is right and what is wrong, it is necessary for you to then do what is right. And that's why the founding fathers decided to separate from the mother country. As far as the 16th through the 19th paragraphs, I think that what Coolidge is trying to say is that the ideas underlying the Declaration are American ideas. Long before some of the principles that we think of as being core to the American identity, principles articulated by Locke in the 1690s, or Voltaire, or some of these other European thinkers. Coolidge points to some American clergy, specifically, I think, congregational clergy in New England, who, as early as 1638, were already saying some of the ideas that would later be articulated, perhaps more philosophically, but no more truthfully, in America in the 1630s. And so he mentions Reverend Thomas Hooker, who was a Puritan divine, I believe, or Reverend John Wise in 1710. He wrote a great sermon that I have somewhere in a collection of early American sermons. And in all of these things, they are already articulating in American pulpits the ideas that would later shape the Declaration of Independence. And if you read a book by a historian named Ola Winslow, she wrote a book called Meeting House Hill. And her argument is that so much of what happened in the Declaration of Independence already happened in the American experience prior to that. For example, during the Great Awakening, when there was a revitalization of preaching of the gospel and more liberal churches were going in different directions, there were individual congregants who would write their own little declarations of independence, declaring the reasons why they were leaving the church that they were born in and going to another church because it was no longer teaching the truths of the gospel. And so, again, this idea that what happened in 1776 wasn't foreign to America, it wasn't brought over by European intellectuals, it came out of the American experience, and it was preached by the American version of the intellectuals, which would be the pastors. Pastors were much more intellectual back in those days, I think, than many are today. And so they articulated very clearly some of the basic ideas, the equality of human beings, the freedom of human beings under the law. All of these things came out of the American mind and not necessarily first out of the European mind.
You talk about paragraph 21,
Mhm.
and you write there's a quote here, profound philosophy which Jonathan Edwards applied to theology, and you say he's referring to Locke. Tell me about that.
Well, my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert on Edwards by any means, but I certainly understand that many of Locke's deeper epistemological concerns and deeper moral concerns, Jonathan Edwards found a way to weave those into his theological thinking. So you could even say that Edwards initiated a distinctly American theology in a way that was certainly not contrary to what, say, Calvin or Luther or things like that would have said, but he articulated it in a distinctly American way. And if you read in paragraph 21, Calvin Coolidge writes this. He says, when we come to a contemplation of the immediate conception of the principles of human relationships which went into the Declaration of Independence, we are not required to extend our search beyond our shores. And I really think that is the most important sentence in the entire speech by Calvin Coolidge, because what he is trying to say is that there is a distinctly American mind. There is an Americanism to at least moral and political thinking, which was shaped by American thinking, American philosophy and theology, shaped by the American experience of building a new nation on a new continent where there was no existing civilization. There were people here, but they existed in unstructured tribes. They had no concept of property, they had no concept of the rule of law. Our experience produced a uniquely American mind. And it is potentially available for anyone who chooses to think about it and understand it. But what I think the major thing that we can draw from this is that we Americans don't need to look beyond our own experience to know the truth about what it means to have a good, just, and godly society. We don't need to look beyond our shores. And in fact, I would argue that much of the ideas that were creating problems for America, going all the way back to the radical pro slavery apologists, all of that was ideas coming from other shores, from Germany, from Europe. The progressivism, the anarchism, the socialism, and even the racism that existed in America, the white supremacy, all of that was much more distinctly European ideas than it was uniquely the American mind.
So the Americans were put in a position at this time where they didn't have as developed a university system as Europe did. So many of the young men in the United States that would become influential politically and culturally would be sent to Germany for their schooling.
Yes.
And this is why, when you had the flowering of communist thought in the mid 1800s in Germany, then you have an echo of that several generations later in the United States.
Mhm.
And so in 1926, Coolidge describing this, he's aware of this trend. He's aware, for instance, of the fact that Woodrow Wilson, the person he's arguing against, was educated in the German school.
Mhm.
So what he does here is he points out that the thinkers in the United States that built the United States were able to tie their ideas to their own observation and their own logic, not being dependent on tradition. And this is a distinction that we all should understand. There's a distinction between grounding your understanding of reality in your tradition versus in your observations. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of what he's offering here, pointing out that we do not need to trace it to traditions and authority. We do not need to prove that our way of governing or our way of thinking about the world is aligned with, say, Immanuel Kant.
Mm.
Not important. Then you write here in your notes, why is he asserting this? Well, he knew that all of the ideas that were creating problems for America, progressivism, anarchism, socialism, even racism, were German ideas, foreign ideas. But then you go on and you point out in paragraph 22, whatever else we may say of it, the Declaration of Independence was profoundly American, an
Yes.
expression of the American mind. Well, let's go on to the next paragraphs there, 23 and 24. Another quote from Coolidge: "A spring will cease to flow if its source be dried up. A tree will wither if its roots be destroyed." Speculate on what territory needs to be reclaimed if America can be truly reconnected to its source and its roots. So,
Yeah.
yeah, share
Can
your
I?
thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I listed a couple here. The first one is, our philosophy needs to be radically changed. The philosophy that guided the American founders, most directly, I would say it would be the Scottish Enlightenment, the common sense realism of men like Thomas Reid and things like that. But that was fundamentally an Aristotelian school of philosophy. It was shaped by empiricism to an extent, but it was more than just empiricism. It was looking at the facts on the grounds, but then drawing conceptual conclusions based on the facts on the ground. Whereas the philosophy that dominates academia today is, as you said, Kantian. It's very much a priori. It's saying that we can't come to any universal eternal truth with our minds. All we have is our own inner workings of our minds, and it's going to cloud everything we see. And that's why you have all these different approaches to thinking today: women's studies, gay studies, black studies, all of that. I think we need to, reclaim education in general in our country. We need a radical reframing of what higher ed looks like, and we need school choice. Most of the great men of the 19th century in America were homeschooled. They were educated by their parents. They maybe got some local education. And then a lot of their education was going out and learning from the real world and apprenticing with experienced people and learning that way. And today, so much of education is you sit in a classroom, you learn from your teacher, you go out and you do all these other things that have nothing to do with your life or reality outside the classroom. We also, I think, in terms of our spirituality, we need to go back to an older Edwards style understanding of revival rather than the one that's most popular today, which is a Finney style of revival. Revival by technique, revival by collective meetings. Whereas for Edwards, revival was about individuals being confronted with their sin, being called to repentance, and then clinging to the promises of Christ. And we're not doing that in our churches today. We're relying much more on a Finney-esque approach to our faith to get enough people in our churches to meet our budgets or whatever. And then, a revival of the entrepreneurial spirit, all of those things. I think all of that is a part of the spring of America. It's what gave America its distinctive character. A Scottish realist common sense philosophy rooted in Aristotle, education that's based on reality, revival that is based on actually preaching the whole gospel, and a sense of entrepreneurial vocation. I think all of those things are necessary. And I think Coolidge would agree with me because he was raised with all of those values. I think he would say we need to reclaim those kinds of things to have a rebirth of true Americanism, not the Americanism of the kinist sense of, we're here because we're European culture or white European culture or whatever, but Americanism rooted in the distinctly American experience and American way of thinking about life.
I want to share one of my favorite paragraphs here. It's the second to the last one. And I'll just read about the first part of that paragraph. He writes, under a system of popular government, there will always be those who seek for political preferment by clamoring for reform. While there is very little of this which is not sincere, there is a large portion that is not well informed.
Maybe.
And then he writes, in my opinion, very little of just criticism can attach to the theories and principles of our institutions. There is far more danger of harm than there is hope of good in any radical changes. We do need a better understanding and comprehension of them, and a better knowledge of the foundations of government in general. Our forefathers came to certain conclusions and decided upon certain courses of action which have been a great blessing to the world. Before we can understand their conclusions, we must go back and review the course which they followed. We must think the thoughts which they thought. So his main criticism against the American people and leadership at that time was not that they were failing to make progress, it's that they were failing to understand and live up to the progress that had already been made.
Hmm. Yeah. And if I can make just one more observation, Cody, I know we're going a little long here, but in paragraph 28, Coolidge writes, they, the founders, undertook the balance these interests against each other and to provide three separate independent branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial departments of government, with checks against each other in order that neither one might encroach upon the other. These are our guarantees of liberty. And I think it's really important that Coolidge makes the argument in the 1920s that it is the structure of our government, separation of powers, checks and balances among the powers that guarantees our liberties much more than the Bill of Rights. Justice Scalia would later go on to make this impassioned plea, similarly, that it is the structure of our government that does this. And this is a direct slap at Wilson because, as if you know his writings, his argument is, look, the structure of the American government may have worked for a small agrarian 19th century republic, but we need to radically change it where we have an all-powerful executive and a professionally trained bureaucracy that does everything. And Coolidge is basically saying here indirectly, if you get Wilson's vision of government, your liberties are not going to be guaranteed. And we can see that today because America, the American government today is much more Wilsonian than it ever has been. And I think it's a tribute to Coolidge that he saw that in the 20s.
When we compare the vision that Coolidge had to the vision that we see on the new right or the woke right today,
Yes.
or the progressive left, we realize that the debate here between the woke right and the progressive left and the woke left, this is a debate among Wilsonians
Mm-hmm.
or Schmittians, if you want to think about it in German terms, like Carl Schmitt, the one that wants the unbound executive. It's a
Yes.
question of just which party gets to put an unbound executive in charge of the country.
It's
That's
still German
Wilsonian.
philosophy.
Yes. It's German either way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap up this episode. In the last paragraph, you made a note that we need to reacquaint ourselves with a specifically American mind, and you tie it back to that theme that we raised at the beginning. The spiritual creates the material. What would you like us to understand about that?
Just that ideas have consequences. The basic idea that the moral and political ideas that you hold and that you promulgate or that you tolerate are going to have consequences in the American system. And I would argue that whether you want to call it American conservatism or classical liberalism, I'm fine with either term at this point. They have not done a sufficient job of pushing back against the ideas that have had the most consequences in America. We are much more akin to a Bismarckian welfare state today than we are anything resembling what the American founders intended. And in order for us to get back to that, we need to radically rethink, deepen, and passionately articulate the ideas that are going to lead to better consequences. And I think those ideas can be found in guys like Calvin Coolidge, in guys like Ryan Graber, Cody Leibolt, and Jacob Brunton in their book, and in many of the founding fathers. Read the ideas of John Adams. John Adams was a great political thinker. Read Thomas Jefferson, even though he's not my favorite, to be honest with you. I think there was some French ideas that got mixed in with Jefferson later in his life. But we really have to be equipped with deeper and more profound ideas if we want to have different consequences that we're having in this country.
That is the theme that we see in Coolidge's speech right at the end, the last two paragraphs, because he talks about how the American nation was created by people of deep learning. And he does
Yes,
not only mean the intelligentsia, he means that every man thought it his responsibility to be a deep student of the scripture because they didn't have a lot of other books at that time. But
right.
to learn what he could at the meeting house, to learn what he could from the people that would visit their town or village, that would share, this is what's happening in the world. This is what people are talking about. These are the principles. They would
Yeah.
listen. They would be engrossed, he says, and they would learn. But he says that they were not so much engrossed in how much they knew or in how much they had as in how they were going to live. Their attitude was, we're going to use the ideas that we gain in order to shape how we value things and how we choose to spend our time on earth. And he says they were scantily provided with other literature, but they were widely acquainted with the scripture. And over
Mhm.
a period, about 150 years leading up to 1776, they were subject to this discipline in their religious life and educational training and in their political thought of taking ideas seriously. He says they were people that came under the influence of a great spiritual development and acquired a great moral power. So before you can have a great nation, you have to have great men. And
Mhm.
before you can have great men, you have to have great ideas. So this is his final paragraph. He says, no other theory is adequate to explain or comprehend the Declaration of Independence. It is the product of the spiritual insight of the people. We live in an age of science, of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our Declaration. Our Declaration created them. The things of the Spirit come first. Unless we cling to that, all our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may appear, will turn to a barren scepter in our grasp. If we are to maintain the great heritage which has been bequeathed to us, we must be like minded as the fathers who created it. We must not sink into a pagan materialism. We must cultivate the reverence which they had for the things that are holy. We must follow the spiritual and moral leadership which they showed. We must keep replenished that they may glow with a more compelling flame the altar fires before which they worshipped.
Mhm.
So here, a religious man shares his understanding of spiritual values and how that connects with the American country. So thank you for listening to this episode. And Jeff, I'm excited to continue these discussions with you as we continue discussing things like the work of Leonard Peikoff, the work of Ayn Rand, as we connect these other thinkers that are distinctly American thinkers. Maybe they are not religious in many cases, but there is a moral worth to what they talk about. It's interesting to note that the writings of the objectivists, Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff and others, they don't talk about Coolidge all that much. And I'm starting to get a sense about why when I look at this speech, because it's difficult for them to own him. But it's far easier for Christians to appreciate what is in here, understanding the connection between Christianity and these things that make America unique.
Hmm.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode. And if you want to get on our email update list, please go to christianintellectual.com. You can find information there. God bless.